I'm Dr. Melody Brown Burkins. I am the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies at Dartmouth's Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I'm also a very proud alumna of the Guarini School of Graduate and Advanced Studies. So I'm a proud Dartmouth alumna and got both my master's and my PhD here long ago. When I got my PhD, I actually studied at the intersection of Earth system science and environmental studies, and I worked in the Antarctic dry valleys, and I did soil science, biogeochemistry of soils, and looking at climate change and how that impacted the small microorganisms and the soil structure in Antarctica. My studies looked at both how the soils reacted, the soils of Antarctica reacted and the soil microorganisms reacted to climate change, and were they in any way, shape, or form telling us about the future? And that was before I moved into a sector of really government and policy as well. After I got my PhD fully in the sciences, I was very interested in how that scientific information influenced policy, and just as we were talking about how there's a kind of a cyclical understanding of how science, how soils and climate and soils, I was very interested in not only how science could influence and inform policy, but also how policy could inform the future of science and the future of knowledge creation. So I did do work in Washington, D.C. I've worked in higher education, administration, and policy engagement. And when I've now moved my career to looking back to be honest, I grew up in the Arctic. I grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska. So coming back full circle at my alma mater to be the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies and look at the Arctic through this science and policy lens for climate and the future of the Arctic. The wonderful thing is Dartmouth gave me these tools and sent me on my way, and now the policies of the Arctic for climate and then for the governance of the peoples of the Arctic is absolutely fascinating, and it brings all of those skills to bear. I need to understand not only the science of climate change that's moving forward and the science that all the Dartmouth faculty and graduate students bring to the future of Arctic policy, but we also have to, what I learned in Washington, D.C., is how do you connect that science to the real lives of the people. And of course I work for a senator from Vermont, but now looking at the Arctic, how do we understand the communities of the Arctic, the peoples of the Arctic who have thousands of years of stewardship? How is climate change impacting them? What is the science and what is the indigenous knowledge and the community knowledge we need to think about climate adaptation, mitigation, and we hope solutions to climate change? The importance of forging partnerships with the Arctic indigenous communities and peoples is at the forefront of the future of Arctic policy, including Arctic climate policy. And I will say Dartmouth's Institute of Arctic Studies, that I've inherited such an incredible history of work by former directors, Orrin Young, Ross, Virginia, is that Dartmouth developed this strong partnership and understanding of including and centering Arctic knowledge in its past that has let it and let me start to forge these partnerships for the future. We also work very closely with the Department of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Dartmouth, and so we have an understanding that not all institutes of Arctic research or studies have about the importance of those relationships, and we keep those at the core of our institute. With doing that, it's still, yes, there is more and more voice of Arctic indigenous peoples. I would say it is really because the Arctic indigenous peoples themselves, it's not that people are listening more, it's the Arctic indigenous peoples have demanded and required that we listen. And again, Dartmouth has done a very good job of doing that to date, and we need to do it even more. And we hope we can actually be a very strong supporter of that voice throughout Arctic policy, Arctic climate policy, Arctic governance, and the future of the Arctic, because it is a voice that needs to be heard. It is a voice that had been underrepresented, and for Dartmouth to actually be part of that conversation in an ethical, equitable, and inclusive way, which is what groups such as the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the Sami Council, others leading indigenous Arctic peoples have asked for. They've written down, they've shown us what they want. We have to listen. And so it is a huge part of the future of Arctic policy. Dartmouth is very open to this inclusive and centered partnership of Arctic knowledge, but we have to do more. We haven't done enough yet. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking on climate change, on a warming planet, on people's livelihoods in the Arctic. And the though we do have this pause with working with the Russian Federation, the other partners in Arctic science, in Arctic policy, recognize that we need to continue. There are also interesting partnerships that are being created bilaterally, multilaterally, with indigenous peoples across various groups of Arctic nations and Arctic observing nations to advance the knowledge we need, the inclusive knowledge we need for the future of the Arctic. And there are still some partnerships with Russian indigenous peoples and some Russian programs that were already in process before the pause. Depending on the country, some are moving forward. It's a diverse pattern of who is working together and who is not, but there is a attention to this fact. It's an important shift in Arctic cooperation, and it will change the direction of our cooperation and our science for the near future and possibly decades. As challenging as all of these situations are for the future of our planet, for the future of climate change, for the future of including voices, there is hope. I see it every day because I work at Dartmouth and I get to see the next generation of students, undergraduates, graduates who are not sitting back. They're leaning forward. They're asking how they can make a difference in my class, coming into my office. How do I get engaged in Arctic? How do I get engaged in governance? How do I get engaged in changing the future of our planet? And so that gives me hope. There is no passivity. There is anger. There is eagerness to learn and to understand. And there's an openness that I don't think I've seen before too, to understand the importance of connecting with Arctic indigenous communities, Arctic indigenous knowledge, understanding that what we learn here at Dartmouth is what an incredible privilege and gift, and there is more. I say sometimes that we can't have more inclusive, equitable, and ethical solutions if we're not actually starting with the inclusive and equitable knowledge that exists all around us, and we need to be more open to actually have the informed, ethical, inclusive ways forward that will save our planet. And so when I say those things to the next generation of undergraduates, graduates, and I will say partners who want to work with Dartmouth on this journey, I hear reception from it. So I'm hopeful for the next generation of Arctic scientists, Arctic knowledge-holding leaders. I'm hopeful and excited to see the partnership we have with our Native American and Indigenous Studies program that recruits heavily from Alaska and Indigenous places around the world. I'm also very hopeful when I work with Dartmouth alumni who are in powerful positions around the world in finance, in investment, who are talking about the importance of climate change no longer as a challenge to their profit, but actually recognizing that profit, their position in the world, has to do with more ethical engagement, more thoughtful and sustainable engagement in the Arctic and around the world. I do hear this. Some might say I'm just too optimistic. I am a realist. I worked in science and policy my entire life, and I have not heard these conversations before, so I have to be hopeful. I have to help spur them on and send the students there and see if we can actually change the future.